Parents kick out their eldest daughter and her newborn baby to welcome the younger sister and her boyfriend. But then this happens. Deborah, at 27 years old, had always carried the burden of being the eldest in a family that seemed to never recognize her qualities. From childhood, she felt the weight of living in the shadow of her younger sister Betty, 22 years old. Betty was the center of attention. Intelligent, charismatic, and full of promise, the younger sister soon stood out as the family's golden girl. Wherever they went, their parents praised Betty, highlighting her achievements, while Deborah, more introspective and marked by an unwavering sense of responsibility, seemed to exist only as a support for others' brilliance. Her parents, though they never clearly voiced their preference, made it evident through gestures and actions. The approving glances, words of encouragement, and the widest smiles were reserved for Betty. For Deborah, there were silences and often a coldness that hurt more than direct words could. She had always been the one to put in effort to help at home, carrying the responsibility of being an exemplary daughter, yet her actions rarely received recognition. It was as though her parents saw her only as a duty fulfilled, while Betty was celebrated as the family's promising future. Despite this, Deborah didn't harbor resentment toward Betty. Perhaps it was the weight of habit, but she accepted her position without complaint. Deep down, there was a sense that her role in the family was more practical than emotional. However, beneath her calm exterior, a latent sadness existed. She was not blind to the constant comparisons or the emotional distance between her and her parents. What hurt the most, however, was that unlike Betty, she never felt comfortable sharing her feelings or asking for support. She had learned early on that her strength had to come from within. It was in this environment that Raymond came into Deborah's life. At 23, he wasn't the type of man her parents would consider ideal. Young, hard-working, and honest, Raymond had an easy smile and a sincere gaze that quickly won Deborah over. He was a mechanic at a local garage, and although he didn't have an academic background or a promising financial future, he demonstrated dedication and responsibility, qualities Deborah deeply admired. However, when she introduced him to her family, disapproval was clear. To Deborah's parents, Raymond represented a threat to the image of perfection they sought to maintain. He didn't fit what they considered a good match, and that was evident in the way they treated him. Comparisons to Betty were inevitable, especially since the younger daughter was studying at a distant university and making plans for a brilliant career. The already cold relationship between Deborah and her parents became even more tense. When Deborah became pregnant early in the relationship, what could have been a joyful moment turned into a turning point in her relationship with her family. Her parents were shocked and saw the pregnancy as a consequence of choices they disapproved of. To them, the baby was not seen as a blessing, but as a reflection of what they considered Deborah's mistakes. Still, Raymond became a pillar of support for Deborah. He took responsibility with determination and promised to care for her and the baby with all the love he could offer. However, financial limitations complicated the situation. His work as a mechanic paid poorly, and he still lived with his parents. So they decided that at least during the pregnancy, each would remain in their respective homes. The following months were challenging. Deborah, emotionally weakened by her already difficult relationship with her parents, now faced even more evident disdain. The constant judgmental looks and reproachful comments became part of her daily routine. She spent most of her time alone, planning how she would offer a better life for her child, while Raymond worked tirelessly to save up and build a more stable future. When Larry was born, the situation at Deborah's house worsened. The grandparents, who could have seen the grandson as an opportunity for a fresh start, treated him as a constant reminder of the choices they disapproved of. The innocent and lively baby was often ignored. Deborah did everything she could to give him the love and care he deserved, but her parents' indifference was painful. They didn't see him as a grandson to love, but as a reflection of Deborah's decisions. Meanwhile, Betty lived in a completely different world. Studying in another city, she continued to build the life her parents considered exemplary. Betty's phone calls were always an event at home. Her mother would light up when she spoke about her studies and future plans, while Deborah and Larry were almost overlooked. Any news about Betty was celebrated, while Deborah's presence was ignored. The contrast between the two daughters was both evident and constant. Deborah pressed on, torn between the love for her son and the rejection she faced within her own home. She found solace in Raymond's efforts and the little life she held in her arms. With each passing day, her strength grew, even though the environment around her insisted on reminding her that, to her parents, she and Larry were nothing more than an unwanted burden. It was a morning like any other at Deborah's house. The sun shyly entered through the curtains of the small living room where Larry played with some colorful blocks on the carpet. Deborah, sitting beside him, watched her son with a quiet smile while folding his clothes that she had washed the night before. The routine was peaceful, but the weight of the environment around her made the days exhausting. In the kitchen, her mother prepared coffee, moving with the usual urgency of someone with many tasks ahead. The interaction between them was minimal, as usual. Suddenly, the phone in the house rang. Deborah lifted her eyes instinctively but didn't move. She knew her mother would answer it. From the other side of the hallway, she heard the familiar sound of hurried footsteps and then the phone being lifted. "Hello? Yes, it's me," her mother said. And immediately her voice took on an upbeat tone, something Deborah hadn't heard in a long time. For a few moments, the conversation that followed was a string of disconnected words, mixed with laughter, expressions of surprise, and pure joy. Deborah, curious, tried to focus on the words, but she could only catch fragments. Something about a visit, about being very happy, and the overall tone was of contagious happiness that didn't seem to have a place in the daily life of their home. After a few minutes, the conversation ceased, and Deborah heard the phone being placed back on the receiver. Her mother entered the room with a bright smile and eyes still glowing from what seemed like great news. Deborah, intrigued, turned to her and asked naturally, "What happened? Why are you so happy?" Her mother let out a sigh full of emotion and with a gleam in her eyes replied, "Your sister Betty is coming home, and guess what? She's bringing her boyfriend. He's rich, Deborah, rich. Finally, someone who makes the right choices in this family." Deborah blinked slowly, processing those words. Her mother's joy was so evident it hurt. It wasn't hard to see the pride and excitement that always appeared whenever Betty was the subject. Without waiting for any reaction from Deborah, her mother went back to the kitchen, humming an old tune softly. A few minutes later, Deborah's father entered the house. He wore a tired but relaxed expression after work. Upon seeing him, her mother practically ran to him. "You won't believe it," she exclaimed, pulling him by the arm to the living room. "Betty's coming back, and with a rich boyfriend. She finally found someone worthy of her. Isn't it wonderful?" Her father broke into a wide smile, clearly caught up in his wife's excitement. "Rich? Oh yes, that's great. I always knew our girl would go far. I've said it all along." They laughed together, sharing the joy that seemed to radiate between them. But as she spoke, her mother glanced over at Deborah, who was now kneeling on the carpet playing with Larry. Her smile slowly faded, and a serious expression took over her face. As if suddenly something important had crossed her mind, she turned to her husband and said, "We need to talk, now, privately." Her father raised an eyebrow, confused, but agreed. "Sure, let's go to the bedroom." Without further explanation, they quickly moved away, closing the bedroom door behind them. At first, Deborah didn't think much of it. But as minutes turned into almost an hour, a feeling of unease began to grow inside her. When her parents finally returned to the living room, something was different about them. The expressions of joy had been replaced by an air of awkward seriousness. They stood in front of Deborah, who was now sitting on the couch with Larry curled up in her lap. Her father began to speak, carefully choosing his words. "Deborah, we need to discuss something important with you," he said, his voice calm but carrying something Deborah couldn't fully identify. Deborah nodded, setting Larry beside her on the couch. "I'm listening," she replied, though her eyes already showed she suspected this wouldn't be good news. Her mother took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment before speaking. Her face was tense, but she forced a calm, almost comforting tone as she looked at Deborah. "Sweetheart, your father and I have been talking. You know we've always tried to do our best to keep things balanced in this house, right?" Deborah, sitting on the couch with Larry beside her, looked at them distrustfully. "What do you mean by that? Is everything okay?" She pressed her lips together, feeling a chill run down her spine that already revealed what was to come. "Of course, everything's fine," her father said, trying to sound friendly, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed his false calmness. "It's just that things will change a bit now with Betty coming back." "Yeah," her mother interrupted, still with that tone that seemed to try to soften the words. "You heard, didn't you? Betty's coming home and her boyfriend too. He seems like an amazing guy, has a promising career and, well, we want them to feel comfortable here." Deborah leaned slightly forward, crossing her arms. "And what does this have to do with me? I already know you do everything for her. It's nothing new." Her father sighed, now avoiding looking at her. "It's not that, Deborah. It's just that the situation here at home is a bit complicated. We have to think about space, logistics." "Space?" Deborah raised an eyebrow. "Dad, this house has plenty of space. It always has." "Why are you talking to me like this? You know how things are," her mother said, a slight impatience creeping into her voice. "Betty and her boyfriend will need a room just for them, a place that's cozy, comfortable, and, well, we already have the rooms occupied. We'll have to rearrange the house." Deborah felt her blood run cold. The weight of the words hung in the air, even though they hadn't yet been said directly. She narrowed her eyes and stared at them. "If you're going to say something, just say it." Her father looked at her mother, who now looked uncomfortable. After a moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice quieter. "Deborah, we need you to find another place to stay." A heavy silence fell in the room. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Deborah blinked slowly, as though she were trying to process those words. Larry, beside her, distractedly fiddled with toys, oblivious to the tension that filled the air. "You're kicking me out?" Deborah asked, her voice hoarse, as though she could barely believe what she was hearing. "It's not that," her father exclaimed, raising his hand to calm her. "We're not kicking you out. We're just asking you to understand the situation. It's temporary, Deborah. It's for everyone's good." "Temporary," Deborah repeated, her voice now full of disbelief. "How can it be temporary? Larry and I don't have anywhere to go. You know that." "Deborah, please," her mother began, now showing signs of impatience. "You know how important it is for Betty to have everything perfect. She and Jonathan have a bright future ahead. We need to support that." "Betty, Betty, always Betty!" Deborah exploded, suddenly standing up. Larry looked at her, frightened, but she gently pulled him closer. "It's always been like this. No matter what I do, she always comes first. I'm just the leftover." "Don't talk like that," her mother retorted, now with a more severe tone. "It's not fair to us. We've done so much for you." "Done so much?" Deborah now trembled with anger. "What exactly have you done for me, Mum? Because all I remember is you ignoring me, comparing me to Betty, saying I should be more like her. And now, because of her and her rich boyfriend, you think you have the right to throw me out." Her father, who had remained more quiet until then, intervened, his voice firm. "Deborah, you need to understand we're not doing this because we want to. It's not personal, but look at your situation. You're here with a kid, not working, not contributing to the house expenses. We did what we could, but this is becoming unsustainable." "Incredible," Deborah murmured, feeling tears beginning to fall down her face. "You think I'm here by choice? I didn't ask to be treated like this. I didn't ask to depend on you." "You made your choices," her mother shot back, her voice now cutting. "You got pregnant by a mechanic who can barely support himself, and now you expect everyone around you to bear the weight of that?" "He's the father of my child," Deborah shouted, her voice trembling. "He works hard, does the best he can, and I'm doing the best I can." "It's not enough, Deborah," her father said, crossing his arms. "Betty's an example. She's always been good at everything she did, always had ambition, always made us proud. And you chose this path." Deborah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she looked at them, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something, but the pain in her throat was suffocating. Finally, after a long silence, she murmured, "Fine. I'll pack my things and leave." Her parents exchanged a quick look, maybe of relief, maybe of exhaustion. "We thought it would be best for everyone," her mother said, now calmer. Deborah knelt beside Larry, wiping her tears as she hugged him. "Let's go, my love. We'll find a better place than this." Larry looked at her with curiosity, not understanding what was happening. Deborah's parents moved away in silence, while she felt the pain turning into a silent rage that burned in her chest. Deborah then picked up Larry in her arms and went to the bedroom, her red eyes trying not to let any more tears fall as she looked at her son. She entered, placed Larry on the bed, and grabbed a few suitcases from the closet, starting to pack the things she could carry. Each item she folded seemed heavier than the last, as if the very act of packing the suitcases confirmed that once again she was being discarded by those who should protect her. With the bags packed, she took a deep breath, grabbed her phone and dialed Raymond's number. He answered almost immediately. "Deborah, is everything okay?" he asked, concerned, hearing her labored breathing. "No, Raymond," she replied, her voice trembling. "My parents, they kicked me out. They don't want me to stay here with Larry." On the other end, there was silence, as if he needed a few seconds to process what he had just heard. "What? This can't be real. They really did that?" Deborah closed her eyes, trying to keep calm. "Yes, they said there's no space for us because Betty's coming back with her boyfriend. I tried to argue, but it was useless. They've already made their decision." Raymond took a deep breath, clearly upset. "I can't believe they could be so cruel. This is absurd, Deborah." After a pause, he continued, his voice determined. "I'm coming to get you. I'll be there in a few minutes. Wait outside with the bags and Larry, okay?" She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you, Raymond. I'll wait for you." Hanging up the phone, Deborah gathered the bags she had packed, leaving Larry sitting on the bed for safety. She walked through the house to the living room where her parents sat. They watched her in silence, as if they wanted to say something, but neither of them spoke. Their gazes were cold, distant, as if the decision they had made was just a trivial detail. Without saying a word, Deborah carried the bags outside, carefully leaving them by the door. She returned to the bedroom, picked up Larry in her arms, and grabbed the remaining bags. When she came back to the living room, she stopped in front of her parents for a moment. With a mix of irony and pain in her voice, she finally broke the silence. "Thanks for being the best parents and grandparents anyone could ask for," she said, with a bitter smile, before walking out and slamming the door behind her. Outside, she waited only a few minutes before she saw Raymond's old car approaching. He parked quickly and got out. Without saying a word, he hugged her tightly and kissed her forehead. "It'll be okay," he whispered, holding her by the shoulders. Then he turned to Larry and gave the baby a small kiss, who looked at him with curiosity. "Hi, my champion, Daddy's here." Without wasting time, Raymond started putting the bags in the car's trunk while Deborah watched, relieved that she wasn't completely alone. As soon as everything was loaded, they were all in the car, ready to leave. On the way, the silence prevailed, but Deborah finally decided to speak. She began recounting the details of her conversation with her parents, each word full of hurt and sadness. Raymond listened attentively, without interrupting, while Deborah told everything that had happened. When she finally finished, she fell silent for a few moments, looking out the car window. Then, with a hesitant voice, she asked, "Raymond, where are we going?" He looked at her quickly before returning his gaze to the road, a slight smile appearing on his lips. "To my parents' house," he answered firmly. Deborah blinked, surprised. "Do your parents know? Are they expecting us?" Raymond shook his head. "No, not yet, but I know my parents, Deborah. When we explain the situation, I'm sure they'll welcome us. They've always wanted to be closer to Larry, and they'll understand that this is the best thing for now." She sighed, a mix of relief and worry. "Do you really think they'll accept us? What if it doesn't work out?" Raymond placed a hand gently on hers, squeezing it lightly. "Trust me, they won't turn us away. They're not like your parents." Deborah smiled for the first time in hours. The rest of the trip was quiet. Deborah looked out the window, trying to hold back the tears that still insisted on falling, while Larry napped in her lap. When they finally arrived, Raymond parked the car in front of his parents' simple but welcoming house. He turned off the engine and quickly got out, going to the other side to help Deborah with Larry and some bags. After organizing everything, he turned to her with a reassuring smile and said, "Come on, let's go inside." Taking the key from his pocket, he opened the front door, signaling for her to follow him. As soon as the door opened, the familiar sound of the television echoed from the living room. Raymond's parents were sitting on the couch, distracted by a program. When they heard the door, Raymond's mother was the first to turn her head. "Raymond, you're home late today," she said curiously, before noticing Deborah and Larry entering behind him. The surprise on her face was evident. "Oh, Deborah, Larry, what a pleasant surprise. Is everything okay?" Raymond's father got up from the couch, adjusting his glasses while looking at the group. "Good evening. We weren't expecting visitors," he commented, his deep voice friendly, but still surprised. "It's not really a visit, Dad," Raymond started, closing the door behind them. "We need to talk. It's something serious." He looked at Deborah, who was holding Larry against her chest, her nervousness visible on her face. Raymond's mother's smile wavered, replaced by a look of concern. "Of course, son. Let's sit down and you can explain." They all settled in the small living room. Deborah held Larry in her lap, while Raymond leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know where to begin," Raymond said, running his hand through his hair. He took a deep breath before continuing. "Deborah's parents kicked her and Larry out of the house today. They have nowhere to go." The silence that followed was heavy. Raymond's mother placed a hand on her chest, shocked. "What? Why? How could they do something like this?" Deborah, her voice low and full of emotion, began to explain. She told them about Betty's arrival, her rich boyfriend, and how her parents had decided that she and Larry no longer had a place at home. With every word, her eyes filled with tears, but she managed to finish without completely breaking down. Raymond's parents listened in silence, exchanging looks filled with disbelief. When Deborah finished, Raymond's mother was the first to speak. "This is unacceptable. How could they treat you and Larry like this? Your family!" Raymond's father shook his head, visibly upset. "These things are hard to believe. But Deborah, you and Larry don't deserve to go through this." Raymond looked at both of them, waiting for the right moment before continuing. "I know it's asking a lot, but Do you think Deborah and Larry could stay here just until I can rent a place? It won't be for long, I promise. Raymond's parents exchanged a brief look, as if silently discussing it. Then his mother gave a warm smile. Of course you can stay, she said, holding Deborah's hand. You're more than welcome here. This house is yours too. Exactly, Raymond's father added. Stay as long as you need. Larry is our grandson, and you're part of the family now, Deborah. Deborah couldn't hold back her tears. Thank you. Really, thank you. You don't know how much this means to me. Raymond squeezed her hand and smiled, relieved. I knew I could count on you. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. Without wasting time, Raymond went out to the car and started unloading the bags. Deborah, still emotional, went to help, and together they organized everything in Raymond's room. It was simple and tight, but at that moment it felt like the most welcoming place in the world. In the first few days at Raymond's parents' house, Deborah felt out of place, as if she were occupying a space that wasn't hers. Despite the warm welcome, she still carried the weight of the recent rejection and the uncertainty about the future. However, over time, the kindness and care of Raymond's parents began to change that. His mother, always ready to help, spent hours caring for Larry, giving Deborah precious moments for herself. Raymond's father, in turn, seemed to adore his grandson, picking him up whenever he could, and even teaching him funny sounds that made everyone laugh. With a bit more free time, Deborah dedicated herself to helping with house chores. She did the laundry, cooked, and tidied up as a way of giving back the support from Raymond's family. Slowly, she began to feel like part of that home, a feeling she had never truly experienced at her childhood home. Meanwhile, at Deborah's parents' house, the long-awaited day for Betty's arrival finally came. Early in the morning, her mother was in a frantic frenzy, adjusting every detail to ensure everything was perfect. The house smelled of fresh flowers and freshly cooked food, while the dining room table was covered with expensive dishes they rarely used. Deborah's father was also excited, wearing a shirt he usually reserved for special occasions. He spent hours in the garden, trimming the grass and arranging the flower pots, while his wife checked every little detail of the decor. Around noon, a luxurious car pulled up. Deborah's mother looked out the window and, with a shout of excitement, called her husband. "They're here!" Her father left what he was doing and went to the door with her. When the car parked, Betty got out first, wearing a flawless outfit that looked straight out of a magazine. Behind her, Jonathan got out of the car with unshakable confidence, his designer watch gleaming as he helped Betty with her things. "Betty, my dear!" Deborah's mother exclaimed, running to hug her. "I've missed you, sweetheart," her father said, wrapping her in a warm embrace. They then turned to Jonathan, who firmly shook the father's hand and kissed the mother's hand, gestures that immediately won their favor. "We're so glad you're here," her mother said, emotional. "The house hasn't been the same without you, Betty." After unloading their bags and placing them by the door, her parents led Betty and Jonathan to the room that had once been Deborah's. "We've changed a few things so you and Jonathan feel more comfortable," her mother explained, smiling with pride as she opened the door. Betty looked around, noticing how impeccably organized the room was. "And Deborah?" Betty asked casually as she placed her purse on the bed. Her mother hesitated for a moment, adjusting the window curtain to avoid eye contact. "She moved out recently with Larry," she replied, trying to sound carefree. "She's fine. Don't worry." "Oh, I see," Betty shrugged. "Well, we were never really close. I hope she's doing okay." The following weeks went exactly as Deborah's parents had imagined. Jonathan, always charismatic, brought expensive gifts for his in-laws, bought sophisticated food, and took them to luxury restaurants. They felt important and fulfilled, believing they finally had a daughter who reflected the success they had always dreamed of. The house seemed full of life, and Betty and Jonathan were the center of it all. But the calm came to an end one seemingly ordinary afternoon. Betty and Jonathan were sitting in the living room, sharing stories of their experiences while they were away. Deborah's parents listened attentively, captivated by the glamorous tales and opportunities. A loud knock on the door interrupted the conversation. "I'll get it," Deborah's mother said, quickly getting up. When she opened the door, a forceful shove pushed her back, and armed men rushed in, shouting, "Police! Everyone, hands up!" Deborah's father jumped up suddenly, hands raised. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice filled with panic. Betty and Jonathan sat frozen on the couch while the police surrounded the room. One of the officers, with a stern look, held up an official document. "Jonathan Davis, you're under arrest for involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, gang formation, and a long list of crimes. Betty Davis, you're arrested as an accomplice." The room fell silent for a moment, except for the sound of the police moving around. Deborah's mother stumbled back, holding herself against the wall. This must be a mistake," she screamed, looking at Betty with wide eyes. "Say it's a mistake, Betty." But Betty, unable to look at her parents, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Jonathan, on the other hand, looked cold, almost indifferent, as the police handcuffed him. "Jonathan, say something," Betty's father pleaded. Jonathan looked up but said nothing. His hard, resigned expression seemed to say everything. Betty began to cry quietly, but offered no resistance as they placed the handcuffs on her wrists. The parents stood frozen, not knowing what to do or say. One of the officers approached and explained, "They've been wanted for weeks. They fled from another city when their assets were seized. Tracking them down to here was just a matter of time." "But we didn't know anything about this," Deborah's mother exclaimed. "They stayed here as family." The officer shook his head. "Still, you'll need to give a statement. We need to clarify how much you knew or if you're involved in any way." The parents were taken to the police station, still in shock. During their testimonies, they learned the whole truth about Jonathan's crimes and Betty's involvement. When they returned home, they were unrecognizable, weighed down by shame and regret. Meanwhile, Deborah and Raymond continued to build a new life, step by step. With the generous support of Raymond's parents, they managed to save enough to rent a simple but cozy home full of love. Deborah found a part-time job, something that not only helped financially, but also restored her lost self-esteem. Raymond, always dedicated, worked tirelessly, but made sure to reserve time to be with Deborah and Larry, building a family based on care and mutual respect. Betty and Jonathan were sentenced to long prison terms. Betty, who had always lived surrounded by privileges and adoration, now faced the weight of loneliness and rejection for the first time. In prison, she had no support to rely on. The occasional letters from her parents, marked with guilt she felt but never reciprocated, were her only connection to the outside world. Jonathan, on the other hand, disappeared into silence, indifferent to the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Deborah's parents remained trapped in a house that once was full of ambition and pride, but now stood silent and desolate. Without the illusions they had created around Betty, they faced the weight of the choices they had made and the loneliness that now defined their days. One night, as the rain tapped against the windows, they sat in silence in the living room. Her father broke the silence, holding his cup of coffee with trembling hands. "Everything we built, everything we planned, it was for pride, wasn't it?" Her mother looked at him, tears in her eyes. "We failed, not just with Betty, but especially with Deborah. We pushed her away, and now we have nothing left." He nodded, the weight of guilt visible in his hunched shoulders. "She tried, you know. She always tried to be good, Worked so hard, took care of so much, but it was never enough for us. All she ever wanted was for us to see her, to love her. Her mother, tears streaming down her face, murmured, "And we didn't see. We only saw what she wasn't, and never thanked her for what she was." The silence that followed was broken only by her sobs. "I wish I could see her, apologize, but I think it's too late now. She's better off away from us." The man sighed deeply, staring at the floor. "Maybe it's better for her, but for us, the silence in this house, it's going to consume us." Deborah's parents' house became a living monument to wrong choices and late regret. They tried to contact Deborah, but their messages and calls were answered politely but distantly. Deborah, gentle but firm, knew she needed to protect the peace and security of her family, something she was finally building with Raymond. As time passed, Deborah and Raymond thrived. Larry grew up in a home full of love, learning from his parents that true wealth lies in human connections, honest work, and mutual respect. And as life went on, her grandparents' house remained a melancholic reminder of lost opportunities and what could have been. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.